They say blood is thicker than water, but in my experience, blood is the first thing that drowns you. My name isn't important. What's important is the cold, quiet phone call I made last April from a parking lot outside a Chase Bank branch at 6 in the morning, the day my youngest son tried to have me declared mentally incompetent to seize my entire estate. He just forgot one detail. Before he was born, I built that bank. And the real story isn't the money. It's the moment you realize the person holding the knife wears your own face. My youngest son wasn't a cartoon villain. He was the boy I taught to drive stick in the church parking lot, the teenager I held when his first girlfriend broke his heart. And yet, last spring, he stood before a judge with medical affidavits claiming I'd lost my mind. The question that consumed me, and that millions of agging parents face silently, is how do you fight back when your attacker used to call you daddy? The answer starts with a single phone call and a detail my son had never bothered to learn. I built my life on a handshake in the back of a dusty feed store in 1973, and for 38 years, it never occurred to me that one day the only signatures that mattered would be on a guardianship petition. But understanding that requires understanding the man I was before I was a target. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, the youngest of 5, son of a cotton broker who taught me that a man's word is his collateral and that banks only lend you money when you can prove you don't need it. In 1973, I was 29 years old with a degree in agricultural economics, a pregnant wife named Helen, and a conviction that the farmers in central Georgia deserved a lender who actually understood the difference between drought tolerance and bad management. So I started First Macon Community Trust with $7,000 and a folding table in a strip mall next to a laundromat. The big banks laughed. I didn't care. For 3 decades, I underwrote crop loans by walking the fields myself. I looked a farmer in the eye, checked his equipment, counted his livestock, and decided if he was good for it. My default rate never climbed above 2%, even in years the big banks lost fortunes. By the time I turned 60, First Macon Community Trust had 17 branches, held nearly $400 million in assets, and was the only bank in the region that never sold a single mortgage to a predatory lender. I was not a billionaire. I never wanted to be. I drove a 12-year-old F-150, wore boots that needed resoling, and believed that the greatest wealth a man could accumulate was the silence of sleeping through the night. Helen passed in 2010. Ovarian cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. My 2 boys were grown by then. Thomas, the elder, lives in Charlotte now, runs a non-profit that builds housing for veterans. We talk every Sunday, but he's a quiet man, steady, the kind of son who will never surprise you, and that is its own kind of gift. My younger son was David. I'm not going to pretend David wasn't loved. If anything, he was loved too much. Helen's pregnancy with him was brutal, and when he finally arrived healthy and screaming, she held him like he was made of glass. I suppose I did too, and maybe that's where the trouble started. David was bright. Too bright, teachers said, for the structure of a classroom. He graduated high school at 17, went to the University of Georgia on a full scholarship, and dropped out after 3 semesters because the professors, in his words, couldn't see past their own syllabi. I got him a job at the bank. He lasted 4 months and left with a severance package I arranged quietly so no one would talk. Then came the string of business ventures, each one the next big thing. A restaurant that failed in 9 months, a landscaping business that didn't survive its first winter, an app idea that consumed $30,000 of angel investment and produced precisely nothing. I funded most of it, always with the belief that he just needed to find his footing. When David showed up at my house in January of last year with a leather-bound planner and a PowerPoint presentation on his tablet, I thought maybe he'd finally turned a corner. He sat across my kitchen table and explained, in the careful tone of a man who'd rehearsed, that I was getting older and it was time to think about my legacy planning. He proposed a durable power of attorney. Just as a precaution, Dad, you're healthy, but life happens. He had the documents ready, with tabs and highlighted sections. I told him I'd think about it. What I actually did was call my attorney, the one who'd been with the bank for 25 years. I asked him to look into David's finances quietly, and what he found kept me awake for the next 3 nights. David was $340,000 in debt. Business loans from banks I didn't have relationships with, credit cards maxed, a foreclosure notice on a condo I didn't even know he owned. The money I'd given him over the years had vanished into a hole he kept digging deeper. I didn't confront him. That was my mistake. I thought I could contain it by tightening access and waiting him out. But here's something they don't teach you about predatory children. When you close one door, they don't retreat. They just find another way in. In March, David started showing up at the bank branch where I still kept a small office. He said he was just checking on me, but I noticed he always walked past the loan officers with a familiarity that hadn't been there before. Then my personal assistant, a woman named Elaine who'd been with me 17 years, told me David had requested copies of my account statements. I revoked his access the same day. That was the day he stopped pretending. 2 weeks later, I received a registered letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. It stated that David, acting out of grave concern for my mental and physical well-being, had filed a petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship with the Bibb County Superior Court. Attached was a sworn affidavit from a clinical psychologist I'd never met, diagnosing me with age-related cognitive decline with features of paranoid ideation. I read that phrase 20 times, standing in my kitchen with the afternoon sun coming through the window and the smell of Helen's old rose bushes drifting in. Paranoid ideation. The psychologist had never examined me. He'd reviewed my medical records, which David had somehow obtained, and concluded from a single mention of mild hypertension and a note about occasional forgetfulness that I was losing my mind. You have to understand something about guardianship law in Georgia. If a judge grants temporary conservatorship, the person under conservatorship loses the right to manage their own money, contract, sue, or make medical decisions. It can be frozen in 48 hours with no more than a hearing where the alleged incapacitated person is allowed to present their own evidence, but only if they can find a lawyer, organize a defense, and gather witnesses in the time between the petition and the gavel. I had 8 days. 8 days to prove my sanity to a court while my son, who owed $340,000, stood to gain control over a bank I'd spent my life building. The hearing was set for April 19th. I called Thomas. He was silent for a long moment before he said, "Dad, I'm driving down tonight." I hired the best elder law attorney in Middle Georgia, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who didn't smile much but knew every judge's coffee order in the circuit. He told me the truth. The deck was stacked. David's psychologist had submitted a 17-page report. Judges are terrified of making the wrong call and leaving an incapacitated elder unprotected. The system is built to err on the side of caution, and caution, Patricia said, often looks like a temporary conservatorship. She told me to prepare for the worst. April 19th was a Tuesday. The courthouse was limestone and tradition, the kind of building where time slows down and every footstep echoes. David arrived with his lawyer in a suit that still had the store creases. He wouldn't look at me, not once. The judge was a woman named Honorable Cynthia Grant, late 50s, sharp jaw, no patience for theatrics. I'd seen her at community events over the years, but never appeared before her. David's lawyer spent 45 minutes building a case out of air and anxiety. Medical records, the psychologist's affidavit, testimony from 2 bank employees David had cultivated who claimed I'd shown confusion during recent board meetings. Patricia cross-examined, scored points, but the current was strong. When my turn came, I testified. I answered every question clearly, described the history of my bank, the crops and the handshakes, my daily routines, but the judge's face remained unreadable. At 11:43 in the morning, Judge Grant adjusted her glasses and said the words I will never forget. She found there was sufficient probable cause to believe I might be suffering from diminished capacity. She granted temporary conservatorship to David Hargrove, my youngest son, effective immediately, with a full competency evaluation to be completed within 60 days. My bank accounts, my equity, my home, my right to write a check or sell a single share of stock, all of it transferred to the son who hadn't spoken to me in 2 months except through lawyers. The courtroom emptied slowly. Thomas gripped my arm, his face white with fury. Patricia said something about appeals and evaluations and fighting back. I heard her, but all I could see was David walking out of that courtroom with a folder full of my life under his arm. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long time. The cracked leather seat, the faint smell of coffee and earth. I thought about Helen. I thought about the feed store and the $7,000 and all the farmers who'd counted on me. And then, very calmly, I remembered something David did not know. because David had never been interested in the actual architecture of the bank. He didn't know that in the original charter of First Macon Community Trust, incorporated in February of 1974, I had inserted a clause that only 3 people alive had ever read. A provision for what I'd called, in my 29-year-old paranoia, a founder's emergency reclamation option. It had been drafted by my first attorney, a man named Ellis Wheeler, who died in 1995, and it stated that if the founder was ever declared legally incapacitated by a court of competent jurisdiction, a designated third-party review committee, appointed in advance and sealed in the bank's corporate records, would be automatically convened to audit the circumstances of that declaration. And the committee had one specific power. It could freeze all conservatorship transfers and restore full control to the founder if cause was found. The committee had been named 40 years ago, and the chairman of that committee was the 78-year-old man who answered the phone at 6 the following morning when I called from the parking lot of the downtown Chase branch, a phone number I'd had memorized since 1990. I didn't know if the clause was still legally enforceable. I didn't know if the committee members were even alive. I only knew that David had spent months studying me for weakness, but he had never bothered to study the bank, and that oversight was about to cost him everything. The name of the man who answered the phone was Harold Templeton, and when I told him what had happened, he was silent for maybe 6 seconds. Then he said, in that measured way of his that made him the best board chairman I ever had, "I've been waiting 41 years for this phone call, Arthur. I was starting to think you'd never need it." Harold is 82 years old now, lives in a retirement community outside Savannah near his daughter, but his mind is a steel trap. In 1974, he was a young corporate lawyer fresh out of Emory who'd agreed to help me draft the incorporation papers for First Macon Community Trust in exchange for 2 bushels of peaches and a ham. He also understood something most lawyers never will. A bank built on trust can be destroyed by a single untrustworthy heir, so he wrote a failsafe into the charter. Article 12, Section 4, the founder's emergency reclamation option. It was drafted with language so specific that it could only be triggered by exactly what had happened, a court-ordered conservatorship of the founder based on alleged mental incapacity. Harold still had the original signed document, the seal, the committee roster. He told me to meet him at his storage unit the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. Thomas sat up with me in the kitchen, a pot of coffee between us, and neither of us said much. Around 2 in the morning, I asked him what he thought David was doing right then. Thomas looked at his hands and said, "Probably inventorying what he thinks is his." That was the truth, and it burned. I found out later that the same afternoon the judge signed the conservatorship order, David had walked into the main branch of First Macon Community Trust, presented the court documents, and instructed the branch manager to freeze my personal accounts pending transfer to a new account under his name as conservator. He'd also sent an email with a subject line that said transition of authority to all 17 branch managers, announcing that he was assuming oversight of the bank's operations. People who'd worked for me for decades were told to treat him as the new owner, not the CEO, not a temporary manager. The owner. The only thing that slowed him down was the bank's own internal structure. My personal wealth was interwoven with the bank's corporate assets, and to liquidate those you needed board approval. He was working on that, but he could freeze, and freeze he did. My checking account went cold at 3 p.m. on April 19th. I had $147 in my wallet and a son who just made himself a multimillionaire on paper. That's what I was staring at when the sun came up on April 20th. The storage unit was out past the fairgrounds, a climate-controlled place with fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper. Harold was already there, seated in a folding chair he'd brought himself, with a metal box on his lap. It looked like a small suitcase from the 1970s, olive green, with combination locks. He opened it, and inside was the original corporate charter, typed on a manual typewriter, with the notary seal slightly smudged because the notary had been his secretary and she'd been nervous. He pulled out Article 12, Section 4, and read it aloud to me, adjusting his glasses. The clause was simple in concept and devastating in execution. It provided for a 3-person review committee, appointed in the charter and granted irrevocable authority to convene in the event of a judicial finding of founder incapacitation. The committee's sole mandate, to determine whether the circumstances of that finding constituted a threat to the bank's integrity, and if so, to issue a reclamation directive that would immediately void any conservatorship authority over bank assets and restore all rights to the founder. The committee had one power beyond that, and it was the power that made David's entire plan fragile. It could order a full independent financial audit of any party who had petitioned for the conservatorship, and the findings of that audit were admissible in any subsequent legal proceeding without privilege. Harold had picked the other two committee members back in 1974, and he'd kept in touch with them over the decades out of sheer, stubborn fidelity to an obligation he'd hoped would never come due. The second member was retired Judge Margaret Clemens, the first black woman to serve on the Georgia Court of Appeals, now 90 years old and living with her niece in Athens. The third was Reverend Samuel Peters, a Baptist minister who'd been the moral compass of Macon's black business community since the civil rights era and had co-signed loans with me back when no downtown bank would look at a black farmer's application. Two of the three committee members were African American, and that was deliberate. Harold had wanted the committee to be immune to the argument that it was just a club of old white men protecting one of their own. The clause said the committee's decision had to be unanimous. That meant I needed all three of them to agree that David's conservatorship was a fraud on my competency and a threat to the bank's stability. By noon that day, Harold had arranged a conference call. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed in a room Thomas had booked so David's people wouldn't come to the house, and listened to three voices from my past decide my future. Harold explained the situation, the court hearing, the psychologist who never examined me, the $340,000 debt, the emails David had sent to branch managers claiming ownership. Margaret, the judge, asked the hard questions. "Arthur, I need you to tell me honestly, are you experiencing any cognitive decline?" I told her the truth. "I forget where I put my glasses sometimes. I wrote down a phone number wrong last month and had to call back. I'm 78 years old and I'm not sharp in the same way I was at 40, but I can still look at a balance sheet and spot a calculation error in 30 seconds, and I can still name every farmer I ever lent money to." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's not diminished capacity, that's Tuesday." Reverend Peters asked why David had done it. I told him about the debt, about how I'd closed his access to my accounts, about the years of bailouts that had run dry. He said, "I've seen this in my congregation more times than I care to count. A child stops seeing a parent and starts seeing an inheritance." He sighed, and I heard 40 years of pastoral grief in that sound. The vote took 12 minutes. They asked me to leave the call while they deliberated, and I went into the bathroom and splashed water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw Helen standing behind me in my memory, the way she used to lean in the doorway and say, "Arthur Hargrove, you are the most stubborn man I ever loved." When I came back to the phone, Reverend Peters was the one who spoke. "Arthur, we are in unanimous agreement. This conservatorship is a perversion of the law designed to protect the vulnerable, not to arm the predatory. We are issuing the reclamation directive." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 30 hours. But Margaret added something that changed the whole shape of what was coming. "Arthur, the directive will restore your rights, but the judge doesn't have to accept it. The court can fight it, David can fight it, and that will take time. In the meantime, you need to know what your son is doing inside the bank right now, because a man who would use a guardianship petition to steal from his own father is a man who will not stop at anything." That was the moment I understood the fight wasn't just about getting my name back on an account. It was about stopping a hemorrhage that was already flowing. I asked Harold to get the directive to the court and to David's lawyer by end of business that day. He drafted it in the hotel lobby on a laptop his grandson had taught him to use, using language that invoked the charter clause, cited the committee's vote, and demanded immediate reversal of the conservatorship. He faxed it to Judge Grant's chambers and emailed copies to the Georgia Secretary of State's Corporations Division, the bank's board of directors, and the branch manager at the main office. The fax machine beeped at 4:57 p.m., and then we waited. I want to tell you what David did during those 48 hours, because it reveals exactly what kind of predator hides inside a son who has learned to see his father as a resource. At 9 a.m. on April 20th, The morning after the conservatorship was granted, David met with a real estate broker from Atlanta and discussed listing 4 of the bank's physical branches for sale. Not the land, which the bank leased, but the buildings, which First Macon Community Trust owned outright. The assessed value was just under $6.2 million. He also placed calls to 2 of the bank's biggest depositors, a poultry processing cooperative and a regional hospital network, attempting to renegotiate their interest rates upward, reportedly presenting it as a restructuring to improve the bank's liquidity. Both depositors balked, and one of them called Elaine, my longtime assistant, to express concern. Elaine, who had been locked out of her company email by David's instructions that morning, called Thomas from her personal phone and told him what was happening. Thomas relayed it to me, and I felt the calm that comes right before real anger. My son wasn't just trying to steal from me. He was trying to dismantle the bank itself, selling off its assets for cash like a chop shop stripping a car. He didn't care about the depositors who'd trusted us for decades. He didn't care about the employees who'd been with me since before he was born. He was treating 4 decades of work like a fire sale. Meanwhile, on the evening of April 20th, David's lawyer received Harold's reclamation directive. According to what I later pieced together from court filings and witness accounts, the lawyer called David at home and told him, in uncertain terms, that a previously unknown corporate provision had been triggered and that his conservatorship might be voided before it was fully exercised. The lawyer suggested a tactical pause. David's response, as reported by that lawyer in a later deposition, was, and I'm quoting as close to verbatim as I can from the court transcript, "I don't care what some old document says. The judge gave me the keys, I'm driving." That night, David accelerated his timeline. He instructed an Atlanta investment firm to prepare a liquidation proposal for the bank's entire bond portfolio, valued at just over $62 million, with settlement to a new account under his control. He included a note that the transaction needed to close within 5 business days. He also fired the bank's chief financial officer, a woman named Martha Chen, who had been with me for 22 years and knew every irregularity in every ledger. The termination letter cited insufficient cooperation with conservator directives. Martha called me on my cell phone, her voice shaking, not with fear but with fury. "Arthur, he's burning the place down. The bonds he's trying to sell are the ones we set aside to collateralize loans for black farmers and small cooperatives. If those bonds move, 3 dozen families lose their operating capital this planting season." I told her I knew and that I was working on it, and that I needed her to do something hard. "Stay calm, document everything, and wait for my signal." She said, "I'll be ready." At 7 a.m. on April 21st, Harold and I walked into the chambers of Judge Cynthia Grant with a motion for emergency status conference. We argued that the reclamation directive, combined with evidence of imminent asset dissipation, required immediate judicial suspension of the conservatorship. The judge read the charter clause, the committee's signed resolution, and the affidavits from Martha and Elaine detailing David's actions. Her face was troubled, but she was also a jurist who believed in process. She noted that the charter clause had never been litigated, that its enforceability was a novel question of corporate law, and that she would need to hear arguments. She set a hearing for April 23rd, 2 days away, and in the interim prohibited David from selling any assets or firing any employees without court permission. It was a temporary injunction, but it stopped the bleeding, and it gave me a window. That window was 28 hours, because on the morning of April 23rd, when the courthouse doors opened, David Hargrove was planning something that would change the fight entirely. He had found something in the bank's records, something I'd never thought to protect, and when I walked into that courtroom, I would discover that my son wasn't just trying to take my money. He was trying to rewrite the entire history of who I was. What David found was a file from 1975, buried in a storage room at the main branch, containing the original loan application of a black farmer named Elijah Roy. Elijah Roy was a man with 80 acres of peanuts outside Fort Valley, a wife named Cora, 5 children, and a credit score that didn't exist because banks didn't extend credit to black farmers in 1975. I knew Elijah personally. He went to Reverend Peters's church. He had calloused hands and eyes that didn't look away. And when he came to me asking for $12,000 to buy seed and repair his irrigation system, Every bank in Georgia had already told him no. I approved the loan. But here is what David's lawyer presented to Judge Grant on the morning of April 23rd, and here is what made my blood go cold. The file contained the original promissory note, and on that note, Elijah Roy's signature was witnessed by a notary who had backdated the document by 6 days. 6 days. The reason that notary backdated it was because the planting window was closing and the bank's official loan committee wasn't scheduled to meet until the following week. If we waited, Elijah would miss the season and lose the farm. So I told the notary to put an earlier date on it and push the paperwork through. It was technically a falsification of a bank record. It was also the only way a black farmer in central Georgia was going to plant his crop that year. Elijah Roy paid back every cent of that loan with interest by harvest. He farmed that land for 31 more years. His son became a veterinarian. His granddaughter is a professor at Spelman. The backdated document had never been hidden, but it had never been flagged either, because no one had ever gone looking for a reason to destroy me. David went looking. The courtroom on April 23rd was smaller than the first one, a hearing room with wood paneling and the smell of old law books. Judge Grant was on the bench. Patricia Hendricks sat beside me. Harold was in the gallery next to Thomas, wearing a suit that was probably older than the judge. David arrived with his lawyer and a new face, a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, expensive haircut, carrying a leather briefcase. I learned later he was a forensic accountant from Atlanta who specialized in uncovering financial irregularities for hostile takeovers. David had hired him on retainer the day before, using my frozen funds to pay his fee. The irony of that arrangement was not lost on anyone in the room. David's lawyer, whose name was Markham, opened with what he called newly discovered evidence of a pattern of financial misconduct dating back to the bank's founding. He presented the Elijah Roy file, the backdated notary stamp, and a narrative that painted me as a man who had been bending banking laws to my own purposes for 40 years. "Your Honor," he said, "this is not a one-time lapse. This is the original sin of First Macon Community Trust, and it establishes a clear pattern of disregard for regulatory compliance that continues to this day. We believe this evidence is directly relevant to the question of Mr. Hargrove's judgment and his fitness to manage his own affairs, let alone a $400 million institution." Judge Grant looked at the document. She looked at me. "Mr. Hargrove, do you dispute the authenticity of this file?" I stood. My knees ached slightly, but my voice was steady. "No, Your Honor, that is a genuine bank record. The notary date was altered." A murmur moved through the room. "But," I continued, "I want you to understand why. In 1975, there was not a single bank in Georgia, including the federally chartered ones, that would lend money to a black farmer for agricultural production. Not one. Elijah Roy had collateral, he had experience, he had a contract for his crop. He lacked only the right skin color for the loan officers in downtown Macon. I backdated that document so he could plant his peanuts before the window closed. He repaid the loan in full with interest. The bank made money. The community gained a thriving farm. If that is a crime, I will plead guilty to it right now and accept whatever sentence you impose." Patricia touched my arm, a signal to stop talking, but Reverend Peters stood up in the gallery. He didn't ask permission. He just rose, tall and deliberate in his black suit and clerical collar. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Grant hesitated, then nodded. Reverend Peters walked to the front and stood beside me. I was there in 1975. I brought Elijah Roy to Arthur Hargrove's office because my congregation had been praying for a miracle, and Arthur was the only miracle available. He didn't falsify a document to enrich himself. He moved a date 6 days backward so a man could feed his children. That is not fraud. That is righteousness in a crooked system. David's lawyer objected. Judge Grant overruled him. She asked Reverend Peters to continue, and he did, for another 10 minutes, describing the history of the bank's relationship with the black farming community, the loans no one else would make, the partnerships that had sustained families for generations. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt like church. But David wasn't finished, and this is the part I didn't see coming, the part that made me realize my son had gone somewhere in himself I couldn't recognize anymore. Markham stood and requested permission to call a new witness. The witness was a man named Gerald Stout. a former bank examiner with the Georgia Department of Banking who had been fired in 2005 for accepting kickbacks from a predatory lender in Valdosta. I knew the name because I had been the one who reported him. Gerald Stout took the stand, and under questioning from Markham, he testified that in 2004 he had conducted a routine examination of First Macon Community Trust and had flagged anomalies in the bank's agricultural loan portfolio. Anomalies that, according to Stout, had been buried by the bank's management and never properly addressed. He claimed he had been pressured to drop his investigation, and when he refused, he was terminated on fabricated charges. None of this was true. The actual investigation in 2004 had found nothing, and Stout had been fired for taking envelopes of cash from a subprime mortgage operation. But David had found him, paid him, and put him on the stand to create the impression of a decades-long conspiracy of concealment. Patricia shredded him on cross-examination. She produced the termination records from the Department of Banking, the evidence of the kickbacks, the sworn statement from Stout's former supervisor. Stout's credibility evaporated, but the damage was done. The narrative had been planted in the court record. I was no longer just an old man who sometimes forgot his glasses. I was being painted as a lifelong operator who had built his bank on a foundation of regulatory evasion and racial favoritism. The word Markham used, carefully, deliberately, and only once, but once was enough. The morning session ended, and we broke for lunch. I sat in a diner across from the courthouse with Harold, Patricia, and Thomas, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely afraid. Not of losing the money had never been the point. I was afraid of losing the story. The meaning of my life's work was being rewired by a son who had learned exactly where to apply pressure to make the whole structure crack. Thomas said, "David's paying people to lie. We can prove that." Patricia said, "We can, but right now he's not trying to win on the facts. He's trying to create enough doubt that the judge extends the conservatorship while everything gets sorted out. Time is his weapon. Every day his name is on the accounts is a day he can do damage we can't undo." That was when Harold set down his coffee cup and said something that reframed the entire fight. "Arthur, your son has made a strategic error. He's so focused on attacking your past that he hasn't noticed the present closing in around him." I asked him what he meant. Harold smiled, the thin, precise smile of a man who had been playing chess with the law for 60 years. "He's spending your money to attack you. His legal team, his forensic accountant, his paid witness, all of it is being funded from accounts he accessed through the conservatorship, which means he is using funds he holds as a fiduciary to wage a personal war against the person he owes a fiduciary duty to protect. That is not just unethical, that is a felony." Patricia's eyes sharpened. She pulled out her phone and stepped outside to make a call to the district attorney's office. Harold explained further. Under Georgia law, a conservator has a strict legal obligation to act in the best interest of the protected person. Using conservatorship funds to litigate against the protected person in a dispute over the validity of the conservatorship itself is a textbook case of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. David wasn't just morally wrong. He had walked himself into a criminal exposure he apparently hadn't seen coming. Patricia came back inside 10 minutes later with the news that an assistant district attorney had agreed to open a preliminary inquiry. It wasn't a prosecution yet, but it was a shadow falling across David's path that he didn't know was there. The afternoon session began at 1:30. Markham called 2 more witnesses, both bank employees who had been fired years ago for cause and had grievances they were happy to air. Patricia dismantled each one, but the rhythm of the hearing was grinding toward an ugly conclusion. Then, at 3:15, Patricia stood and asked the court for permission to introduce a new piece of evidence. She walked to the bench and placed a document in front of Judge Grant. It was a certified copy of the Founder's Emergency Reclamation Option, the full committee resolution, and the sworn affidavits of Harold Templeton, Judge Margaret Clemens, and Reverend Samuel Peters. Patricia argued that the charter clause was legally binding, that the committee had exercised its authority, and that the conservatorship should be terminated immediately. Markham objected, citing the novelty of the provision, the lack of precedent, and the ongoing questions about my fitness. Judge Grant recessed to review the documents. For 45 minutes, I sat in that courtroom waiting while a judge in a back chamber decided whether a clause written in 1974 by a 29-year-old idealist and a young lawyer paid in peaches would hold up against an assault by a son who turned himself into a stranger. When Judge Grant returned, her expression was unreadable. She said she was not prepared to rule immediately on the enforceability of the Charter Clause, but she was prepared to rule on the conduct of the conservator. She had reviewed the preliminary financial records of David's actions since April 19th, the attempts to sell branch buildings, the solicitation to liquidate bond portfolios, the firing of Martha Chen, the hiring of a forensic accountant using frozen assets. She found that David Hargrove had engaged in conduct inconsistent with the fiduciary obligations of a conservator, and that there was probable cause to believe estate assets are at imminent risk of dissipation. Effective immediately, she was freezing all of David's authority over bank-related assets and appointing an independent monitor, a retired bank examiner named Carla Hendricks, no relation to Patricia, to oversee all transactions pending final resolution. She did not terminate the conservatorship yet, but she stripped David of his power over the money. David's face, which I had been watching throughout, went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, rage, and then something I had never seen on my son's face before: fear, real, unvarnished fear, because for the first time he understood that he wasn't just losing the fight, he was exposed. The assistant district attorney's inquiry would pick up speed. The financial forensics would reveal the debt. The employment of Gerald Stout, a disgraced bank examiner, would become a liability rather than an asset. And somewhere underneath all of it was the fundamental truth: David had counted on being buried. He had tried to have his own father declared incompetent so he could empty the bank accounts before the creditors came calling. Thomas and I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. Harold was on the phone with Margaret Clemens, telling her the news. Patricia was already drafting the motion to terminate the conservatorship permanently. I stood on the courthouse steps and looked down the street toward the main branch of First Macon Community Trust, the building I'd opened in 1982, with Helen cutting the ribbon and both boys holding balloons. David was somewhere inside that building right now, or maybe in his car, or maybe at a bar somewhere, trying to figure out how a plan that had seemed flawless had collapsed so completely. And I felt something unexpected, not triumph, grief. A deep, quiet grief for the boy who had held my hand at his mother's funeral, who had cried into my shoulder, who had once believed the world was good and I was part of that goodness. That boy was gone. I didn't know when I'd lost him, or if I'd ever really had him, or if somewhere along the way my love had looked like weakness to a son who was learning to see everyone as a transaction. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the fight wasn't over. David was cornered, and cornered men are dangerous. He had one last move, and I needed to be ready for it. David's last move wasn't a legal filing. It was a letter, delivered by courier to my house on the morning of April 25th, 3 days after the judge stripped his authority. It was handwritten, which surprised me because I hadn't seen my son's handwriting in years. The letter was 3 pages long, and it did not apologize. It did not ask forgiveness. Instead, it laid out a final demand. He would drop the conservatorship petition voluntarily, sign whatever papers I wanted, and disappear from Macon forever. In exchange, I would pay off his debts in full, $340,000, and sign an agreement never to pursue criminal or civil action against him. He called it a settlement. I called it the last hand he would ever try to play against me. And I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the same table where he'd once pitched his legacy planning presentation, and I thought about Helen. I thought about the boy in the church parking lot learning to drive stick. I thought about the man who had stood in a courtroom and let a paid liar call his father a criminal, and I made my decision. I gave the letter to Patricia Hendricks. She read it in silence, then looked up and said, "This is a confession. He's offering to drop a legal petition in exchange for money and immunity from prosecution. That's not a settlement. That's obstruction of an ongoing court proceeding and arguably extortion." She filed it with the court that afternoon as an exhibit in support of terminating the conservatorship for cause. The final hearing was set for April 28th. In those 3 days, the independent monitor, Carla Hendricks, completed a preliminary audit of David's actions during the 6 days he'd had access to bank accounts. The audit found that David had attempted to transfer just under $2 million from my personal investment accounts to a new account in his name. 1.4 million of that had been blocked by the bank's internal safeguards, triggered by the unusual activity. 600,000 had moved before anyone noticed. He'd also liquidated a certificate of deposit worth $93,000 and wired the funds to an escrow account controlled by his Atlanta firm, which he described on the wire form as conservatorship administrative expenses. It was a lie. The escrow account was the retainer for his legal team and the forensic accountant. In fewer than 144 hours, my youngest son had tried to extract over $700,000 from accounts that weren't his. That number, Carla said, was conservative. On April 28th, the courtroom was fuller than it had been. Word had spread. Farmers I'd lent money to decades ago, employees of the bank, members of Reverend Peters's congregation, and even a reporter from the Macon Telegraph. David sat at the defendant's table, though he wasn't technically a defendant yet. His lawyer, Markham, had filed a motion to withdraw from representation that morning, citing irreconcilable differences. Judge Grant denied it until the hearing concluded, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Patricia presented the audit findings, the letter, and the testimony of the 3 charter committee members, all of whom were present. Harold Templeton took the stand and explained the founder's emergency reclamation option with the clarity of a man who'd been waiting decades to do exactly this. Judge Margaret Clemens testified by video call from her niece's living room in Athens, her voice thin but her logic unassailable. Reverend Peters spoke last, and he did not talk about the law. He talked about the farmers, the families, the loans that had no business being made in a fair world that wasn't fair yet. He talked about Elijah Roy's granddaughter, the professor at Spelman. He talked about what it meant for a white banker to bend a rule so a black farmer could plant his crop. And then he looked at David, and he said, "Young man, the real reckoning isn't with this court. It's with the God who sees what you did to your father." Judge Grant recessed for only 20 minutes. When she returned, she read her ruling from the bench. She found that David Hargrove had abused the conservatorship process from its inception, that the petition had been filed in bad faith and premised on a medical evaluation that was procedurally deficient and substantively unreliable. She found that his conduct as conservator constituted gross breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and attempted conversion of protected assets. She terminated the conservatorship effective immediately, restored all rights and properties to me, and referred the matter to the district attorney for consideration of criminal charges, including elder financial exploitation, perjury, and attempted theft. She also ordered a full financial accounting within 30 days and froze David's personal assets pending that accounting. The gavel came down at 11:42 in the morning. I'd walked into that courtroom a ward of my own son. I walked out a free man, and David Hargrove walked out under the shadow of a felony investigation. But that is not where the story ends, because the question I'd been asking myself since the day David filed that petition wasn't just how I would fight back. It was why. Why had he done it? The debts explained the motive. The opportunity explained the timing, but neither of those answered the deepest part of it. 6 weeks after the ruling, I drove to Atlanta alone to see David. He was out on bond, living in a rented apartment, his legal situation unresolved. I hadn't spoken to him since the courtroom. He opened the door and he looked older, diminished, the shine gone. He didn't ask me in, but I stepped inside anyway because I'd earned the right. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table not unlike the one in my own house. I asked him directly, "What did you think was going to happen?" He was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that took the breath out of me. He said, "I thought you'd be too tired to fight." That was it. That was the whole calculation. Not that I was incompetent, not that the bank was mismanaged, just that I was old, and old people get tired, and tired people surrender. He'd bet everything on my exhaustion, and he'd lost because he never understood that a man who spent his life building something from nothing doesn't know how to stop fighting. It's not in the design. I didn't forgive him that day. I'm not sure I ever will, not in the way forgiveness is usually meant. But I told him I wouldn't testify against him, not because he deserved mercy, but because Helen's last request to me had been to look after our boys, and if I sent one of them to prison, I'd be breaking the only promise to her that ever mattered. The district attorney went forward without me. The forensic evidence was enough. In September, David pleaded guilty to 1 count of financial exploitation of an elder person, a felony in Georgia. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and full restitution of the $693,000 he'd taken. The restitution came from the sale of his condo and a lien on his future earnings. He will be paying me back for the rest of his life. As for the bank, I returned to my office the Monday after the ruling. I walked past Elaine's desk, where a stack of messages from depositors and farmers waited, and I sat down in my chair and looked out the window at the town I'd served for nearly half a century. Martha Chen came in with a cup of coffee and a report on the bond portfolio that David had tried to liquidate. It was intact. The injunction had held. Not a single farmer lost their operating capital. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let 30 seconds of silence fill the room. Then I called the branch managers, one by one, to tell them I was back. But here is the part of the story I've never told publicly until now. The surprise I mentioned at the beginning, the detail that changes everything. David had been right about one thing, though he never knew it. My mind was slipping, not in the way his psychologist had invented, not in a way that would have justified a conservatorship, but I'd noticed it myself months before the petition was filed. Small things, forgetting a farmer's name I'd known for 20 years, losing the thread of a conversation. One afternoon, I wrote a check for the wrong amount and stared at it for 10 seconds before I realized what I'd done. I went to a neurologist in Atlanta, quietly, without telling anyone, and after a battery of tests, I received a diagnosis. Early-stage vascular dementia. Manageable for now, not incapacitating, but real. I had told no one, not Thomas, not Elaine. Not a single soul, because I was terrified that if the word got out, the bank's depositors would lose confidence, the board would push me out, and everything I'd built would crumble before I had a chance to protect it. David had sensed something, I think. He'd noticed the small stumbles, and instead of asking me about them, he'd weaponized them. That's the tragedy at the center of this story. My son was wrong to do what he did, but he wasn't wrong that I was fatting. In the months after the ruling, I began making plans. Quiet, careful plans. I restructured the bank's governance to ensure it could run without me. I promoted Martha Chen to president and gave her full operating authority. I transferred the majority of my shares into a trust controlled by a board of directors that included Harold Templeton's son, a young attorney with his father's integrity. And I told Thomas everything. He sat with me in the neurologist's office, asked the questions I needed asked, and held my hand when the doctor explained the likely trajectory. He didn't cry, my son Thomas, but his eyes were wet, and that was enough. Today I still go to the bank most mornings. I sit in on loan committee meetings. I water my tomatoes. I drive the old F-150 with the cracked mirror, and I'm not afraid anymore. Not of David, not of the disease, not of the closing of the day. Because I learned something in that courtroom that I wish every agging parent could understand before it's too late. The law is a shield, but only if you wield it before the sword is already at your throat. I had the foresight 41 years ago to build a failsafe into my bank's charter. Most people don't, and the predators know that. They count on your silence, your shame, your hope that the child who betrayed you will come to their senses. They count on you being too tired to fight. Don't be too tired. Make the call, find the lawyer, tell the truth. The phone I picked up at 6 that morning outside a Chase Bank branch wasn't just a phone, it was a door. And on the other side of it was Harold Templeton, and behind him were 41 years of proof that what you build with integrity can survive anything, even a son who forgets who he came from. That's the real inheritance. I've thought a lot about why I wanted to tell this story. It wasn't for sympathy, and it wasn't to shame David, who is still my son, even if the word doesn't mean what it used to. I told it because when you're inside something like this, when the person coming for you shares your last name, the silence is part of what traps you. You don't call the police because you can't imagine the police at your Thanksgiving table. You don't tell your friends because you raised him, and what does it say about you that he turned out this way? You tell yourself it's a misunderstanding, then you tell yourself it's too late, and all the while, the person who's counting on that silence is moving your money and sharpening their story. Elder financial exploitation is a crime that hides inside family dinners. 5% of older Americans will experience it. Nearly 90% of the perpetrators are relatives, and only 1 out of every 44 cases ever gets reported. I wasn't a statistic until I was. And the only reason I'm not a tragedy is that 41 years ago, a young lawyer named Harold Templeton and I wrote a failsafe into a corporate charter because we were paranoid enough to imagine a future where I might need it. Most people don't have a Harold. Most people don't have a secret clause. But everyone has a right to ask the hard questions before the papers are signed, before the power of attorney is granted, before the joint account is opened, before the child, who's been a little too interested in your estate planning, becomes the person holding your checkbook. Here's what I want you to take from this. The predator doesn't always look like a stranger. Sometimes he looks like the boy you taught to ride a bike. The law is slow, but it's also heavy, and when it lands, it lands. But you have to call it down. You have to document. You have to tell someone. You have to fight even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. Because the people who love what you built, your employees, your community, your other children, they need you to fight. Not just for the money, for the meaning, for the story of who you were. I still forget things, names mostly. Yesterday I called Martha Helen and caught myself halfway through. She smiled and handed me my coffee and didn't correct me. That's grace. That's what a life well lived earns you. David is somewhere in Atlanta, working a job he doesn't talk about, making restitution payments that will outlast me. Thomas calls every Sunday. The bank is stable. The farmers are planting. And I am still here, watering my tomatoes in the morning light, driving a truck that's older than most of my tellers, wearing boots that need resoling. Not because I'm cheap, because I've learned that the things that last don't need to look impressive. They just need to be built right. If this story reached you, do me one favor, hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people watching will never do it, but it's what keeps stories like this one being told. And if you know someone who's facing something similar, send this to them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can give a person is the knowledge that they're not the only one who's been through it. My name is Arthur Hargrove. I built a bank on a handshake. I lost my wife. I almost lost my life's work to my own son. And I learned that the best revenge isn't living well. It's living long enough to tell the truth. Thank you for listening.